our meeting of this morning. The next item of business this morning is the address by Mr. Željko Komšić, the Chairperson of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which will be followed by questions to Mr. Komšić. I would like to inform members who are present in the chamber that they can follow the original speech on Channel 8. Members connected remotely, including the chairman of the presidency, can follow by switching to the channel called Special BCMS. Now I want to welcome His Excellency Mr. Željko Komšić, the current chairs of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Good to see you again, Mr. President, although you are far away at home, as I understood, but in modern times we are able to communicate even at distance. Mr. President, we are very happy that you are joining us today virtually. The 24th of April this year, 22, will mark the 20th anniversary of Bosnia and Herzegovina's membership of the Council of Europe. A very good occasion to take stock of the achievements and continuing cooperation, including with the Parliamentary Assembly. I myself, as the former rapporteur on your great country, had the privilege to visit your country several times, and I'm really happy that we now have you here as the President in our Assembly to talk about your country, its possibilities and its problems. For the Council of Europe, Mr. President, and our Assembly, the key objective is to work closely with all member states and support them in their efforts to uphold human rights, democracy and the rule of law, and preserve peace in our continent. And of course, with regard to Bosnia and Herzegovina, peace is a very clear and concrete issue. Maintaining the stability and the democratic rule in Bosnia and Herzegovina is essential also for our work. We therefore are very honored to have you among us today, and we look forward to hearing from you on how we can further develop also our collaboration on shared values to consolidate democracy, human rights and the rule of law in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As you know, Mr. President, this Assembly is strongly committed to continue supporting the democratic developments in your great country, particularly in the context of the ongoing constitutional and electoral reforms, with a view to strengthening in a meaningful way the country's democratic institutions and ensuring compliance with relevant judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. I have said enough, Mr. President. I give you now the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to addressing you on, let's say, unusual way. But at the same time, I have to say I'm addressing you from my home at Sarajevo and not from presidency because I'm corona infected right now. And if you don't mind, I will proceed on my language. Poštovani predsjedniče,
President, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, allow me at the beginning to thank you for this opportunity to address the Parliamentary Assembly in this year when Bosnia and Herzegovina is marking its 20th anniversary of entry to the Council of Europe. Also, allow me to use modern technologies as a means of address so that we can respect all the measures caused by the increase in COVID-19 infections. This will certainly not affect this opportunity to present to you the current socio-political situation in my country. Of course, I will give my presentation through the special prism of the fundamental values of the Council of Europe that I personally have been advocating in my work and which I am sure the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina wish to see embedded in our country's political political and social system. That is why, at the very beginning of my address, I will briefly review the main principles established during the founding of the Council of Europe in 1949, namely the protection of human rights, multi-party parliamentary democracy, and the rule of law, spreading awareness of European identity, conclusion of specific international treaties, securing the continent's unity, and finding solutions to the social problems of Europe. The reason behind these goals is understandable after the end of the Second World War. In the war-ravaged Europe, many countries were in the process of transition towards the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, which at the time was no easy task. The context of the time, especially the geopolitical one, led to the creation of two poles of distinctly ideological nation. One turned towards liberal democracy and market economy, and the other towards the communist doctrine and a centralized economy. Or rather, a bipolar world was created on the global level, and it lasted for almost 5 decades until the collapse of the Berlin Wall, when a whole series of transition processes began in various European countries. Today, however, we have a totally different political relationship in the world, based on a multipolar world order and global powers interests, produced and manifested in different countries of the world. In such circumstances, there's a number of countries that haven't completed their transition processes following the principles of liberal democracy and market economy, which makes them an easy prey for various geopolitical interests of the big players. My country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, is a country with tradition spanning almost 1,000 years, and at different points of time, it had its different internal arrangements. At one point, it was a kingdom lasting for several centuries, and at that time, given the size of its territory, it was the largest country in the region. After that, there were conquests of Bosnia and Herzegovina by different kingdoms and empires, bringing their own culture, customs, and religion, and incorporating them into the social system of my country. Still, Bosnia and Herzegovina survived and outlived such kingdoms and empires. During World War II, the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina joined the anti-fascist movement en masse, participating on the side of those forces that fought against fascism and Nazism. At the same time, during World War II, the citizens made a decision to restore our statehood and joined the then Yugoslavia together with the other then republics. The participation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in former Yugoslavia continued until March 1992, when the citizens decided in a referendum to make Bosnia and Herzegovina a sovereign, independent state. That same year, the Constitution of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina was adopted as a democratic expression of its citizens, already containing the basic principles of liberal democracy and market economy, identical to those embedded in the foundations of the Council of Europe. Bosnia and Herzegovina became a member state of the United Nations in May 1992, thus gaining the status of a subject of international law. In these time periods that I listed, Bosnia and Herzegovina was never a country of divided or segmented society, nor was there any form of discrimination of its citizens. However, the declaration of independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina led to an aggressive reaction of the neighboring countries, which during the war 92 to 95, or rather during the aggression against my country, through war and conquest, they sought to obliterate any existence of Bosnia and Herzegovina and claim part of its territory. Such war activities led to unprecedented horrors, escalating to the crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. All these elements that I've mentioned were also established by the judgments of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia based in The Hague. Those judgments established the existence of several joint criminal enterprises involving individuals and groups of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as those from the neighboring countries, aimed at establishing ethnically clean territories in order to annex such cleansed territories to those neighboring countries. The reason I'm mentioning all this is because in the second part of my presentation, I will clearly point out that such policies are still present in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but the method of war conquest has been replaced by political and diplomatic means, or rather, that some are still continuing to implement their wartime goals in peacetime. The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina ended with the signing of the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was initialed in Dayton and signed in Paris in 1995. It was signed by the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Republic of Croatia, and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, whose legal successor is today's Serbia. Or, as clearly stated in international law, peace agreements are usually signed by participants to a war. This removes any sort of dilemma that there was a civil war in Bosnia and Herzegovina because it was an interstate armed conflict, as established, among other things, by the International Court of Justice in The Hague in several judgments. An integral part of this agreement, colloquially called the Dayton Agreement, is the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina as its Annex 4. So, it is obviously an imposed constitution, not an expression of the democratic will of the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is rather a document which is an integral part of a peace agreement. It defines Bosnia and Herzegovina as a country with two entities and one district with different ethnic communities. In that constitution, which we must all respect, there are many open questions and ambiguities, leaving a lot of room for various arbitrary interpretations, most often inspired by, unfortunately, particular interests of different political elites, both in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the neighboring countries. This constitution established a new political system in Bosnia and Herzegovina that was supposed to evolve towards democratic standards and values, such as those contained in the goals of the Council of Europe. Unfortunately, this never happened. Contrary to this, active ethnic politics in Bosnia and Herzegovina have sought and continue to do so, to create an artificially divided society dominated by ethnic affiliation as the only valid license for political action. Although the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms is an integral part of the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, we must point out here that unfortunately, it is under-implemented in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The reason for such ambitions lies in this unfortunate term, I must say unfortunate term, constituent status or constitutive status, which is mentioned in the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but the Constitution contains no legal definition or any elaboration exactly what it means. And that is why there is a new legal practice, which I consider to be very dangerous, that the use of the term constituent or constitutive serves to reach different goals with the domestic political actors with visible support from the neighboring countries. In such, in my opinion, wrong political and legal practice, somebody's ethnicity becomes a conditio sine qua non for any form of political action, which goes so far so as to make sure that you cannot get a simple job if you've not of the right ethnicity, I mean public service. Isn't that an evident form of systemic discrimination which unfortunately exists in my country? As a legalist here, I can say freely here, the term constituent is actually the source of systemic discrimination in Bosnia and Herzegovina as established in 5 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which I want to list chronologically. Judgments in the cases of Sejdić and Finci, Zornić, Pilav, Šlaku, and Pudarić. These judgments establish clearly the existence of discrimination based on ethnicity and the place of residence, and it orders the respondent state, i.e. the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to introduce the necessary changes to its constitution, removing all forms of discrimination from it. Unfortunately, this has never happened. If we look at the Sejdić and Finci judgment, we will see that ethnic discrimination is a derivative of racial discrimination. Do we need something like that in modern Europe and in a modern liberal democratic order? That's a question for all of us, not just for Bosnia and Herzegovina. I am absolutely certain that we will all agree that we don't need such legal or constitutional frameworks and that we must invest altogether efforts to combat all forms of discrimination. There's a particularly interesting part in the Zornić case judgment, which says clearly that Bosnia and Herzegovina does not have full democracy, but rather limited or restricted democracy through the distribution of political power between ethnic communities called constituent peoples in my country. This lack of full democracy is, in fact, in stark contrast with one of the fundamental goals of the Council of Europe. That is why the Zornić judgment orders Bosnia and Herzegovina to change its constitution to enable the realization of full democracy in which there will be the necessary equality of every citizen of my country. That's a very important issue. How else can we achieve the rule of law or organize a proper law-based state if all the citizens of any country, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, are not equal before the law without any exceptions? How can we achieve a liberal democracy at the core of which is the struggle of equality against all forms of inequality, if we know that in Bosnia and Herzegovina there is this imposition of a system of inequality pushed politically? This is not liberal democracy, which I certainly find unacceptable. It is obvious that the current political system in Bosnia and Herzegovina, based on ethnicity, is creating 3 parallel totalitarian systems based on an affiliation to one of the 3 ethnic communities, trying to govern them autocratically. In such a system, through affiliation with one of the ethnic communities, which is an expression of political exclusivity, is an attempt to control resources, jobs, tenders, public procurement, all kinds of privileges or profits or gains, which clearly creates an environment for corruption of unimaginable proportions. After 26 years since the signing of the Dayton Agreement, instead of evolving the political system into one based on democracy and the rule of law, my country is moving backwards along a regressive path. We are distancing ourselves from democracy, trying to maintain or even strengthen the ethnic political system that generates corruption in all segments of society through the use of ethnic politics and manipulation with the fear of members of the different ethnic communities. That is why it is important to underline that ethnic politics in Bosnia and Herzegovina, once they run out of energy, they reach for emotions and empathy within their respective communities. This is done so by instigating fear that ultimately forms a system conducive to corruption and denial of the rule of law. I believe that we share the same opinion. This political system has no place in modern Europe. Allow me now to use this opportunity in just a few sentences to look at different ideas of those who seek to maintain the principle of inequality in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who propose the introduction of consociational democracy by allegedly copying the political systems of Belgium, Switzerland, Northern Ireland, or South Tyrol. There are at least 2 problems here. First, Consociational democracy is not the same as liberal democracy, and it does not exist in these countries or parts of some other countries, not in the way that consociational democracy was designed. Such countries or parts of those countries have a completely different historical context from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Those political systems are simply not compatible with my country. The second problem is that any introduction of consociational democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina would certainly lead to new proceedings before the European Court of Human Rights, because this type of political model is based on inequality and annulment of the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, regardless of the fact that it contains elements of proportional representation. To use such long outdated political models would certainly be a step backwards in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Such policies go so far to deny the existence of the nation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's a country that has existed for almost 1,000 years. They want to portray any expression of nationality as a political issue. I want to say here today, I am, according to European standards, I am a Bosnian Herzegovinian by nationality. Ethnically, I'm a Croat, because nationality is an expression of belonging to one's own state. The neighboring countries are denying the nation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, trying to use ethnic identities in my country to their advantage, creating thus an environment where we, Bosnians and Herzegovinians, should ask them for consent if we can be Bosnians or Herzegovinians by national affiliation. This is absolutely unacceptable and in complete contradiction with the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. On the other hand, when we look at the decision-making system in my country, the situation is such that any majority in the lower houses, i.e. directly elected legislative bodies, is completely made void through the use of a new political tool called entity voting. In short, this means that in the House of Representatives of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is the lower chamber, 42 MPs, even just 5 of them can block any decision-making because they come from one of the two entities. Is such a thing an expression of liberal democracy? Of course it isn't, because it is obvious that a political minority can block any decision-making to the detriment of the political majority until the minority is satisfied. We have something like this today in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Through obvious separatist activities, the country is held hostage. And ultimately, it's hiding a system of blockages, blackmails, and keeping Bosnia in complete political uncertainty until the wishes and intentions of some political leaders have been met. Isn't that an expression of complete autocracy and a lack of fundamental principles of democracy? To make it worse, the reason for keeping Bosnia and Herzegovina in a state of crisis is because someone is refusing to accept judgments of the International Court in The Hague establishing the crime of genocide. Just imagine, what would disrespecting the decisions of any court mean in your respective countries? Undoubtedly, criminal liability of those who fail to respect judgments of courts. It's very similar with decision-making in the upper house of the parliament, which is the House of Peoples, comprising 15 indirectly elected MPs. They're appointed by political parties. 2 of them, only 2 of them, can block any decision-making so that all the 42 MPs can even make a unanimous decision. Only 2 in the House of Peoples can bring it all down because they need an entity vote. Isn't that a clear indicator of inequality of the value of the votes of the MPs in the houses of the parliament, where 1 vote from a member of the House of Peoples appointed by political parties is worth at least 3 times more than that of an MP from the House of Representatives elected by the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's used as a political tool today in order to prevent normal functioning of the institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina with complete disregard for fundamental democratic principles, and I find this unacceptable. For that reason, there's this new application before the European Court of Human Rights dealing with inequality of votes in the 2 parliamentary houses in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Unfortunately, the application of this principle of constituent peoples in daily decision-making in Bosnian institutions for the past 26 years doesn't serve to protect the right of constituent peoples, but rather to prevent Bosnia and Herzegovina from stabilizing and progressing. Since 2008, which is when Bosnia signed the Stabilization and Association Agreement with the European Union, parties supporting ethnically based decision-making have been using ethnic quotas in decision-making in the executive and the legislature to prevent the adoption of European standards. Laws related to the adoption of the acquis fail in the House of Peoples through ethnic voting or entity voting in the House of Representatives. This happens regularly, although regulations from the acquis do not infringe on ethnic identity, culture, tradition, language, or education as values that these houses are to protect. For that reason, there are dozens of laws from the European agenda waiting in the parliamentary procedure. That's why we can't fill the Constitutional Court of the Federation. We're not appointing governing bodies of many independent law enforcement agencies. That's why we're wasting European funds. Many other things are to the detriment of all the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, all under the guise of fighting for legitimate ethnic interests of constituent people. This is also unacceptable. We're talking about the abuse of the right of constituent peoples to prevent Bosnia and Herzegovina from becoming part of a civilized community of European parliamentary democracies, so that my country can never become an EU member state. These policies are intended to turn my country into a territory where foreign regimes will have an influence over, be it economically or through creating a new Transnistrias in the Western Balkans, in one part of my country. Let me remind you that the European Commission did give a clear legal definition in its 2019 opinion, everything that my country needs to improve in order to continue its long path towards candidate status. At that moment, political actors advocating the disappearance of Bosnia and Herzegovina decided to stop all the processes and bring 3.5 million people back to 1995 by talking about the rights of constituent peoples, by restoring entity competences, and finally by this anti-civilizational resistance towards the punishment of denial of adjudicated genocide and war crimes. And today, when Bosnia and Herzegovina is talking about the need to change its constitution and election law in order to implement 5 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, we have again the emergence of those political forces that have no intention of implementing those judgments, but trying to create a new constitutional arrangements through manipulation with even more profound discrimination that would be shielded behind the inequality of votes of the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Unfortunately, the neighboring countries that are directly involved in this, their goal is quite clear: to achieve all their wartime goals using political and diplomatic means in peacetime. Their intention is reflected in 2 aspects. The first is to use the constitutional and election law changes to create a system where these neighboring countries will have the golden share or the key word in all the decision-making in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and thus complete control over my country. Such intentions can be identified easily anytime they speak about the constituent status of people or the phrase that they will accept anything that the 3 ethnic communities agree upon. Regardless of the fact that they are striking a blow at the foundations of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, they often do things like that in diplomatic talks, even with you, because I believe that you have come across this from time to time. And second, when they see that something like that is failing, then they reach for their allies in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who, on behalf of those neighboring countries, block the work of the institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina to create an illusion that Bosnia and Herzegovina is a dysfunctional state. In addition to that, other than incursions into the political system of my country through their political satellites in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they are trying to control natural and other resources of my country completely. How else do you explain the political intentions of the neighboring countries not to define the border with Bosnia and Herzegovina through an international border agreement on land and at sea, all with the aim of giving them an option to manage the natural resources of Bosnia and Herzegovina? I therefore use this opportunity to ask you all not to accept this type of diplomatic talks because it harms Bosnia and Herzegovina and its citizens. And finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to point out my vision of a solution for Bosnia and Herzegovina. First of all, I strongly believe, and I cannot back down on this, we need to achieve full equality of all the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina to create a society of equal opportunities. This would eliminate all forms of discrimination associated with this phenomenon of constituent peoples. Let me emphasize once again, it is a principle and a tool for creating an environment of persistence, incalculable corruption, of a society where not those who are the best of us can succeed, but those who are suitable or nepotistically connected. Systemic corruption is not an acceptable system for any society, including Bosnia and Herzegovina. Second, it is necessary to change the political system of Bosnia and Herzegovina from a limited democracy. We move towards full democracy as established by the 5 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, but also in compliance with the 2005 opinion of the Venice Commission, which analytically, accurately, and legally specifies all the changes that Bosnia and Herzegovina must take in order to become a modern democratic society. Therefore, I want to take this opportunity to ask you all to study the opinion of the Venice Commission from 2005, because it's very important that we accept this as a form of assistance of the Council of Europe to countries in transition. Finally, changes to the constitution and the election law of Bosnia and Herzegovina must not be made without respecting the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, because everything else will lead my country to further instability, thus the instability of the entire region of the Western Balkans. We all know very well that a citizen, an individual, is the bearer of sovereignty of a country, which must be applied in Bosnia and Herzegovina too. I use this opportunity to ask you all not to agree to any diplomatic and political talks that seek to harm Bosnia and Herzegovina, and you can easily recognize them. They will be outside the fundamental principles of the Council of Europe. I thank you very much for your attention.
And may I thank you, Mr. President, for your vision to the recent history of your country, the actual situation, including its problems and possible way out, according to you, in the direction of modernization of Bosnia and Herzegovina towards a democratic society.